Good evening. We have a special guest today, Parent University. Welcome to Parent University. This is our second Parent University for the season. And we have a special treat tonight with Kyle Knight, who is senior researcher at Maine Human Rights Watch. And one thing special about Kyle is that he's actually from Maine. So he grew up in Winthrop, Maine. So with that, we want to welcome Kyle Knight.
Okay, hi everyone. Some of you are going to be very familiar with what I say tonight and some maybe not, but I think part of what I want to do is contextualize the work that I get to do as part of the LGBT rights program at a generalist global human rights organization. Not only in the sense of what the human rights movement does and how we use similar methodologies or different methodologies, but also just in the context that we're working in today, which is why we're calling it a fake news world. Because so much of what we do has to do with fact-finding and truth-telling, and it's no longer sufficient to just say what you think is true. You have to be very, very strategic about how you do it. And hopefully I can give you some examples of how that works. So, very briefly, I think, the bread and butter of what Human Rights Watch has done throughout its history is to produce long investigative reports. These are the covers of about a dozen of those that we've worked on in recent years. They're intense. They take about a year to produce each. As an organization, we put out 2 or 3 a week on a wide range of issues. As an individual, I can do 2 or 3 a year, depending on what breaking news there is or what urgent situation or how much time we can dedicate to one thing or another. And this is the backbone of our credibility. Since we were founded in 1978, this is what we are known for doing. It is an authoritative, independent source of information that can stand on its own, that can be submitted to a court, that can be a source for the media, and that policymakers can take seriously. Our only bias in this is towards human dignity, if that's what you want to call it. We are very clear about what we're looking for, and we're very clear that we work under the umbrella of international human rights law. But we won't take a side in a conflict, for example, and we won't take a side in a political debate, for example. If you're violating the rights of civilians, we are going to call you out for it. That's where we find our independence to come from. And the way we put these things together is probably most easily explained in a 3-part methodology. Investigate, that's easy enough. I spend about 60% of my time away from my desk talking to people and doing other things to find evidence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Expose, also sort of straightforward enough. It's about producing information, packaging it in a certain way, putting it out in the world in a way that gets people's attention, putting it directly in front of policymakers who can actually make a difference. And then the third part, the change part, is the really, really hard one, because it would be wonderful if truth-telling was sufficient to make the world a better place, but I don't think I have to hammer anyone home on saying that it's not. It's pretty obviously not. But that's really where the investment of the organization and the 40 years of work that we've done matters. So let me try to explain a little bit how we go through these. So we love this slide. I didn't make this, that's why it's so aesthetically pleasing. It shows off how we've been recognized for what we're able to do, including sharing the Nobel Peace Prize in the 90s, including occupying an enormous presence on social media. That's a little bit out of date, but one of the ways we like to talk about our social media presence is on Twitter. We now have about 4 million followers, and we've recently overtaken the World Wildlife Fund as the biggest nonprofit with the most followers in the world. We're proud of that in particular because we tweet about human rights violations and they tweet about cute pandas, and so it's not really a fair competition to begin with. So we're really happy that we've got, it signals that there's a large amount of engagement with this type of work and this type of information, because I would rather see cute pandas as well. So it's not a competition. I just think it actually speaks to the fact that people are engaging in different ways with the stuff that we do. We have an increasing global presence. As you can see here, the majority of our offices are in the US and in Europe. There's no mistake for this. I mean, part of the reason we can have an office open and above ground and legally operating is that the government allows us to do so and allows us to register. That is not possible in a lot of the places that we work. One place I do want to point out, though, that we still have an above-ground, legally registered, fully operational office is in Moscow. We're still able to operate in Russia. It's not without difficulties, it's not without complexities, but it is something that we have been able to do, in part because of the balance that we bring to the work. In part because, let's be honest, when the Ukrainian army commits human rights violations, the Russian government loves us. When the Russian army commits human rights violations and we call them out for it, they're not so happy about it. But they also understand that we're very balanced and we actually criticize both sides. So that's some of the optics that we work with. It's not only that, there's a lot of other things that go on. But the map would be much more populated if we could find other places where governments would be more open to having us, and we could use that as a lever of power for creating local, regional, and global change. And so we've grown. Since 1978, we've grown to an organization of 500 staff. There's about 100 of us who do what I do on research, working on different topics. And specifically on LGBT issues, there's 6 of us in total. We work with our colleagues who are based all over the world. Nothing I talk about tonight is a project that I worked on by myself. That would be outrageous for it to come across that way. So if I start saying that I did this and I did that, that's just for ease of explanation. It's not because I wasn't working with, half a dozen other colleagues who are absolutely amazing and dedicated to it. But actually what I want to do now is stop and show a video with some of my colleagues introducing what it is that we do, because I think they'll actually do a much better job than just having me talk about it. So have a look at this.
Imagine a world where all girls could go to school, where people can speak out without paying a price, where they can worship as they wish and love whom they choose. Imagine a world where people are more important than profit, where you can get justice whether you're rich or poor. Imagine what would happen if people fleeing violence were welcomed instead of feared. Imagine. This is the world we're fighting for. Human Rights Watch works in more than 100 countries on issues that affect all of us.
ইচ্ছে আসলে মা বাবা দিতে না কেরবো খাওয়ানোর কষ্টে একটু মা বাবা দিছে সেজন্য
Our job is very simple. We protect people by speaking out. We defend their human rights.
He was locked up in a hut right here because he had a mental health condition.
Over the past couple of weeks, migrants have been stuck here in Tijuana, right next to the U.S. border, in what has become a humanitarian crisis as a result of the Trump administration's border policies.
Children are not supposed to be placed in institutions, only in exceptional cases, when their rights are at peril.
We investigate abuses of power by corporations, institutions, armed groups, governments.
I've come to Guatemala to look for parents who've been deported by the Trump administration without their children. We don't have any addresses necessarily for these people, so it's a question of getting to the communities, asking around, and trying to find them.
We've refined our method of investigating for over 40 years. And at the heart of it is talking to people, face to face.
And then if you could just draw out all the buildings and the road, as much detail as you can.
We ask questions to establish the facts.
The most important questions are the most simple questions.
What happened to you? When did it happen?
What did you see? What did you hear?
What language were they speaking? What were they wearing?
And maybe most importantly, who did that to them?
Desde ahí me separaron. Desde se quedó ahí en Yuma, Arizona y se quedó no sé dónde.
Eso lo que es la...
We interviewed dozens, sometimes hundreds of witnesses. And verify their accounts with additional evidence.
And we do that in many ways. We get documents, court records, autopsy reports, any type of secondary material that will help to build a story.
We're in Charleston, West Virginia, about to look at some mountaintop removal sites. The coal mines pollute the water sources and the air in areas where people live, endangering their health.
Mining opens up new cracks in the rock, and it all increases contaminant loads of groundwater and surface water.
We are so well equipped today to get to the bottom of things, even in areas that we cannot reach physically.
We are here at the edge of a sinkhole that ISIS used to throw bodies of people it killed or executed. We've been here before, but this is the first time we come here with a drone. We're hoping that using drone technology this time, we will be able to get a clearer view of what lies at the bottom of this pit.
No, we've got something. There are the bodies.
Today, researchers are using an ever-growing toolbox to document violations. And that means we're using technology, satellite imagery and drones, data analysis.
We double check, we corroborate, and we continue to dig for the truth until we get it. Then we broadcast it to the world.
Did KRG forces torture kids into confessing that they were Daesh members?
16 boys told us that they had been tortured, and the consistency of the types of torture used at the very least merit serious investigation by the Kurdistan Regional Government.
Sexual violence so common that it's become an ordinary part of life.
Many North Koreans told Human Rights Watch that when an official or a person in power picks a woman, she has no choice but to comply.
We bring the facts directly to the public.
Hay más de 2 millones de venezolanos que han salido del país huyendo de una crisis de derechos humanos y humanitaria que es dramática.
We join forces with activists and artists to reach millions of people.
Injustamente estás pidiendo que te olvide.
Acompáñanos, Human Rights Watch, a Ricardo Montaner, para decir por qué estamos todos juntos con Venezuela.
We use our investigations to pressure those in power to stop the abuses.
The Uzbek cotton industry and the government, which controlled the industry, forced hundreds of thousands of people to work as forced laborers in the field every year. We did an in-depth investigation, and after we put pressure on the World Bank that was funding some of the projects that use forced labor, literally hundreds of thousands of people were freed from forced labor overnight.
We never give up. We stay with an issue until we get results.
We worked for 8 years to get a treaty to ban landmines. We worked for 7 years to get a treaty to ban the use of child soldiers. And over 100,000 children have been freed from armed groups and armed forces.
What gives me real hope is the people. Despite all of the odds and the pain that they've gone through, they have hope. And that ignites my own hope.
I'm driven by the community of people around the world who are standing up, who believe in systems based on rule of law, respect, human rights, dignity.
This is the world we're fighting for.
So now you got to meet some of the cool people that I work with and see some of the amazing different stuff that we do. I want to talk a little bit about what each of these phases looks like from my perspective as someone who does this and how it's evolving for all of us. So if we look about if you think about the investigate phase, the first phase, the photo there on the left is a friend of mine. I think she's in Kyrgyzstan in like 2010. Doing the fairly typical investigations that we do, talking to as many people as possible. We're not just going to believe one person's story, we're going to start seeing patterns after we've interviewed dozens, if not hundreds of people to understand what really happened. So coming from a journalism background, this is a gift As a reporter, there was so much pressure to get a story, put it out, maybe talk to a handful of people. This is amazing that now I am forced to, by mandate, I am supported to, I'm told to go out and talk to even more, get as many as possible. What we say needs to be the sober, hard truth. We're not just aiming for headlines constantly. We want to make sure we get it right because it matters in the long run. What's really neat is there's a whole group of colleagues, and we're actually now hiring a bunch of people who have these skill sets that I don't even really understand, who are doing research in a whole different way that's super exciting. So this is one, the photo on the right is actually from a presentation you can find on YouTube that a colleague of mine in San Francisco did about how he went and just found publicly available US government data that talked about detention center transfers and could actually track how many times, how frequently, from where to where immigrants were illegally detained and transferred from place to place over time. It's all there. You just need someone who knows how to analyze it and knows how to read it. That screen means nothing to me, but we have people on staff who are able to piece it together in the same way and put out the same types of reports that we do on our traditional methodologies, and this expands. You saw the drone footage that we use. That was one particularly dramatic example of a place that we use it, but it makes a big difference when you can take pictures of stuff. It's a whole different range of evidence that you can present. And then we expose it, then we push it out. Sometimes this does mean sending our executive director for extremely awkward conversations on Fox News. That did not go well, which you can kind of imagine. But the point is we're nonpartisan. The point is if you're gonna put us on the air, we're gonna talk about the issues we care about. And in this case, we are gonna fight with Tucker Carlson, right? He said he was making fun of the disability rights movement and our executive director wasn't gonna put up with it, right? This is the type of thing we're willing to do. This is what we exist to do. But it also means speaking multiple languages. My colleague Nadine can do TV interviews at the drop of a hat in 3 languages, in French, English, or Arabic. And that's the type of thing he's called on to do constantly out of the Middle East. We hold big press conferences. I think it was some point in the late 90s, early aughts, where it no longer was, oh, you know, there's a news story, by the way, Human Rights Watch said something about it. Now the news story is Human Rights Watch said something about it. Like that is actually the headline now in the major papers, and that's a great thing. But we have to use that strategically. We can't just go around saying things. We have to make sure it's spaced out so we're not cannibalizing our own media cycle or not, you know, supporting each other in different ways in the various things that we work on. And the last thing is figuring out a way to actually present information that is meaningful and impactful. So if you look at this bottom right slide, this is a satellite image. It's 2 pictures, one taken on May 23rd, 2017, and one on September 16th, 2017. These are the Rohingya villages in Myanmar that were torched by the military. And because we have a satellite company that works with us and gives us access to their data, we can take pictures when we think something is happening and then actually show before and after. So then our researchers, and you saw one of them in the film, Richard, standing on the other side of the border in Bangladesh, was able to interview hundreds of people, and as they drew out the maps, correspond them to the photos that we took. So it's no longer Human Rights Watch interviewed hundreds of people who said they were fleeing their village being torched. It said, yeah, we did that. We also have a picture from outer space that shows them that you torched their village. It no longer exists. And that really changes the tone in what we're able to do. No longer can the Burmese government come back and say, no, it didn't happen, you're making it up. Because we have a different type of evidence we can put. And then there's the change part. I mean, the change part is, I think, probably the hardest, right? We have to be relentless. We can talk about impact. We can talk about follow through, but it's not simple. A lot of it takes place, I don't even know where I got that picture, but that is a big, looks pretty boring meeting, probably at the UN, and a lot of change happens that way. It's a lot through negotiation and persistence and committees and consensus building and sticking to principles, and we have an entire tranche of our staff who participate in that type of thing. Our advocacy department, they're kind of like human rights diplomats. They're out in major capitals around the world. We have 4 people who work specifically on the UN in New York so they can go to meetings like this and make sure they nudge it in the right direction and build a relationship of credibility with the people who matter. And then the other slide here is the other photo is just showing we never do this alone. Like I can stand up here, I'm very proud of where I work and the work that we do, but there are dozens of organizations out there doing similar things with different methodologies, and it matters. We don't always agree with each other, and that's actually a good thing in some cases. We don't always do the same thing, and that's actually a good thing. But it's never just us pushing for one particular agenda. It's never just us pushing for one particular policy. So these are a couple things that I think that we can think about in terms of the broader context for the global human rights movement, but also what the LGBT rights movement in particular knows inherently from the fight that we've had over the past couple decades in different parts of the world. So let me walk you through these examples, and then I want to talk about one particular project we did that is really relevant everywhere in the world today, but in particular we're trying to push for it. Okay, so naming and shaming doesn't always really work. The historical methodology of saying, bad thing happened and this is the person who does it, we have unshameable leaders in the world. No matter what you think of his policy decisions, he is a different type of target than basically anyone else, except he has a number of peers who behave basically exactly like him, right? There is an unshameable class of leadership in the world now where they're actually proud of their anti-human rights stance and some of their behaviors. And so putting out a report saying that Duterte is ordering thousands of people in the Philippines murdered for alleged drug possession, he doesn't care. He'll tweet it. He'll say, great, yes I am. I'm very proud of that. It's not the same tactic. You have to think differently about how to do it. Well, in working on LGBT issues, we know that, right? This is a project we did back in 2013 and 14. Russia passed a law called the Gay Propaganda Law. It means you can't talk about gay people in public unless it's negative. If you say something positive about gay people in public, they fine you. So people just don't do it. But what it also did is it told a bunch of vigilante gangs that, like, here are some people you can go beat up and we're not going to punish you for it. And that's exactly what they did. Now the difference in this is we can talk about, field missions and meticulous research and interviewing dozens of people. We didn't have to do that in this case. We did. So the guy here, Dimitri, is the guy lying on the floor there, lying on the ground there. That video was put online by the person who beat him up. There was no shame. They were proud of what they did. So from an evidentiary perspective, things are kind of hiding in plain sight in a lot of places. It doesn't mean we don't go investigate. We obviously met him and filmed his side of the story and that type of thing. But it's a very different landscape, and we know this inherently, that you have to tell stories in a different way. You can't just say, this is bad and you're the bad person who did it, and assume that that's going to be effective. We have to think more creatively about it, or we're just going to keep spinning our wheels and it's all essentially going to be in vain. We also know that it doesn't matter what you call yourself. So this is a long legalistic document called the Yogyakarta Principles, written back in 2006. It was the first time a bunch of lawyers and experts got together to talk about LGBT people and international human rights law. A very wonky discussion, a very important discussion. It was the first time UN-level experts on human rights had thought about this and written it down and codified it. The most amazing thing about this document is that if you go search it, and this is just screenshots from my computer, and you search the word transgender or lesbian or gay or bisexual, they're not in there, right? And they're not in there on purpose, because the discussion was not about the label you pick, the discussion was about the rights you are afforded. It's the same thing you could say that, great, you want to call yourself a Christian? Is there only one way of being a Christian? No, we all know there's not, right? So we don't have to talk about someone's right to worship or right to, religious liberty by saying you have to label yourself a certain thing or else you're not allowed to do this thing. That's not how it works. That's not how human dignity works. And so this document was deliberately written so that it didn't include specific terms and leave other ones out. It just said sexual and gender minorities, sexual orientation, gender identity. It talked about concepts. It wasn't shy, but it just wasn't going to lay down if you have to pick this label or you don't count in some way. The most amazing thing, and I have a colleague who's a legal anthropologist part-time and then works for us part-time as well, and he wrote this incredible article way before I even knew him, a few years after the Yogyakarta Principles came out. Within a couple months of this website going up, it's not a UN treaty, it's not official, it's just a website that's hosted by some other NGOs and some experts put it out there. It had been translated into something like 80 languages by volunteers. And it did that because it made sense. The word lesbian doesn't exist in a lot of languages, right? But you can talk about diversity, you can talk about dignity. Those words do exist. And so it also had the utility of being applicable across cultures and across languages, and it's been used in a lot of different places. So the first time the Yogyakarta Principles were ever actually referenced was in 2007, within a few months of when they came out, by the Supreme Court in Nepal, of all places. Like, that speaks volumes to how the universalization of these concepts actually worked. The ability to discuss something without narrowing it down to 4 random words we've picked to assign to people actually works, and why it's effective in that way. We also know through what we do that speaking up is not always easy, right? There is a time in this country, there's a time in other countries where if you're, a civil rights defender, human rights defender, it's actually okay and it's safe. Go on TV, talk about it, tweet about it, do whatever. That's not necessarily true anymore. People are genuinely afraid of the police in some places for very, very good reason. And we know this from a lot of the work we do in LGBT issues all over the world, that you just can't expect people to speak up. But it doesn't mean you can't create spaces to do so. So some of that is me as a writer, right? Taking the stories I hear and figuring out a way to put them forward. But you can see we can produce video clips that don't reveal people's identities, that protect them, allow them to be private, and still are able to tell their story in a way that's very, very compelling. They're still able to let them take the lead in telling their own story, and we just act as a platform, which can be really, really important. And I think that's something that's applicable across the board now. It's not just what we see. And the last point to make is that people hear stories in very different ways. And that includes, in a policy discussion, powerful people who really matter, people who can really make a difference, right? Politicians hear stories in different ways. Different things get to them in different ways. Especially in a moment when, attention spans are shortening, not everyone has that much, everyone's distracted constantly by all kinds of things. That happens to the really powerful people as well. And we know that. I have a couple examples that I think I can try to illustrate. So this is a report I wrote 3 years ago. It was about an unmitigated anti-LGBT crackdown in Indonesia. So Indonesia, up until that point, had been kind of a live and let live culture, no problems whatsoever. They didn't have a colonial criminalization law about homosexuality. It was very placid. They had some groups, some activists, but nothing was really, no problems, right? No real crackdowns. Then beginning in 2016, there were this unmitigated meltdown where politicians decided that this was the root of all evil. And they wanted to create all kinds of fuss about it, which led to violence. This is all what's in the report, right? So I've written a bunch of these reports, probably about 15 of them over time, and I'm convinced my mom is the only one who's actually read all of them. So, and we understand that, right? I don't just say that in jest, but I mean that I understand people aren't gonna sit down and read an 80-page policy report with 400 footnotes in immense detail. God, I wish they would, right? But it's just not gonna happen. So we have to think about ways to tell stories. In this particular case, it was also kind of a popular uprising, right? The tabloid media loved it. There were this is a photo from an actual protest in Jakarta, of all places. People going out and saying no transgender, no lesbian, no gay, wielding swords as they walk down the street, threatening to murder people, putting out notices on social media saying they're gonna come hunt people down. It was really, really scary. And it was all fanned by politicians. I realize the text is quite small, but so this is a timeline from January to March of 2016, and you have 19 different public officials saying kind of the worst things they could possibly think of. So they would get doorstopped by a journalist and they would come up with something to say, or they'd be in a public place and someone would say, "What do you think about the gays?" And they come up with something horrible to say in response to it. So some examples to give you a sense of just how bad it got. There's a couple of it is a mayor of the second largest city in the country. He was speaking at a seminar for young mothers, and he told them, this was unprovoked, I don't know where he came up with this, but he said, "The number one thing I have to tell you is don't feed your children instant noodles or they'll turn gay." And we're just like, okay, and it's ridiculous and it's funny, but you can also imagine a very powerful person saying that to a bunch of relatively impressionable people. This matters, right? On the other end of the spectrum, kind of the fourth one in on the top, you have the Minister of Defense, a very, very powerful person who's in charge of the military, came out and said the LGBT rights movement is worse than dropping a nuclear weapon on the capital city. Because with a nuclear weapon, you can see it. It's an explosion, but the gays are sneaky, right? It's a shadow war, it's a proxy war. They're coming after you in different ways. But it created this incredible threat. And if you think about the history of Indonesia, and we can go deep into this, that is exactly how they started murdering millions of people suspected of being communists in the 60s, right? This is precisely how those witch hunts started. You have very powerful people just dropping in these little comments, putting them out on Twitter. Even if they apologize the next day and say, that's not what I really meant, it's already out there, right? They've already set that spark. So we can do all of this, and this is all in the report that I wrote. But think about this. This is a crisis being driven by powerful people, taken up by people on the streets, vigilantes who want to go out and act on it. Who are we going to ask to stop this? How are we going to put the brakes on this when you have your common folk who probably hadn't thought about the LGBT rights movement before and are now wielding swords to go out and go after people? And the most powerful people in the country are saying, basically, go for it. You know, we don't like this either. It's against the country, it's against Islam, it's against all of these things. It puts you in a real bind from an advocacy perspective. So we knew, and like everything we do, we knew it wasn't snapping your fingers and stopping it, right? This was it was going to be very, very difficult. But we also knew, again, because we spent weeks going out and documenting each of these cases, that there were stories that kind of pierced that narrative and said, this isn't quite as simple as you think it is. It's not just a bunch of gay rights activists versus a bunch of, devout Muslims who are going after them. There are stories that interrupt that and make it a little more complicated. And this is one of them. I took this picture with my phone right after I finished interviewing her. This is a woman named Shinta Ratri. She's a transgender woman in Yogyakarta. And since 2008, she has run a mosque and a boarding school with 45 transgender women worshiping with her. They're all devout Muslims. Some of them are illiterate, but they've memorized the Quran, right? Which I can tell you, very few Indonesian public officials have. So what we did is we made sure to foreground this story because they got attacked as well. As all the NGOs were getting shut down, as all the activists were getting attacked in the media and on the streets, they came under attack as well. This is a house of worship that is legally registered. They are visited by imams from all over the world. They are trying to do a similar program in Pakistan to protect transgender Muslims, right? This is not an activist organization. They are not radical, they are not political, they literally pray together. It is the least provocative thing in a Muslim majority nation. But this is not part of the government's narrative of what they're trying to do. So all we did was foreground this story. And when we got challenged by the government on it, we said, look, we know you're uncomfortable with this. We know, it's political suicide for you to go out and say you support the LGBT community. We get it. We still think you should do it, but we get it. But you have to understand that this is also the people who are getting attacked. It's not your stereotype of a bunch of people running down the street with the rainbow flag. It's people like this. It's the devout Muslims who are making your country look like the epitome of democracy and Islam in the modern world, which is what they like to project out as their image of an entire country. And it worked. We saw people soften in those meetings. We saw officials say, okay, we get it. And there's different things that happened over the years. The Constitutional Court rejected a petition to start outlawing LGBT groups. Small things to make sure it didn't get precipitously worse over time. The chief of police came out with a positive statement telling his police officers to stop doing these random raids. Didn't really work. They still did it, but that's better than him not doing it. It showed a little bit of leadership running against the tide. And so some of it is not so much the data and the long reports and everything. Sometimes it can be one story, and in her case, that was it, right? And she was able to reopen. The mosque is still running. She's doing great. They actually got for Eid last year, so one of the neighbors who felt bad that they got shut down donated a goat, so they were able to eat. And I think it's that type of thing that you can strategically take stories and think about how they work in particular ways. So let's talk about a particular project that's ongoing. And this is one that's really neat, and I think it's one that it's going to work, which is cool. I can't say that about everything. We're never going to completely be able to undo what happened in Indonesia, right? But this is one where actually it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, and it's a matter of tactic. So we're talking about the issue of transgender legal recognition, and I'm going to talk about what we're doing particularly in Japan, of all places. The law in Japan is actually really similar to the ones in a lot of parts of the world. We're working in Japan in particular because the transgender human rights groups approached us and asked us for help to get the government's attention to this. So what is legal gender to begin with, right? Everyone has one. It's on your documents. It's written down. It's how you travel. It's what the police, if they pull you over, not that anyone here has ever gotten a speeding ticket, but if you happen to, this is what they would look at. It's part of the legal identity that you have, right? So this is a trans woman in Nepal who was able to actually get her documents changed to read as a third gender, which Nepal really recognizes, one example. The thing about legal gender is, can you see that? Okay, well, I'll talk you through it. The thing about legal gender is if you think about it and you dive into it and you start looking at it, it's actually kind of arbitrary, right? So on passports, there are 4 things you have to legally have a passport. It has to have the country, it has to have your name, it has to have your birth date, and it has to have your legal sex. Since the late 90s, you can have M, F, or X as your legal sex, right? But you have to have it on there, right? So,
I'm just curious, you're talking US passports or any?
Globally, right? So this is coming up. So it wasn't until the early 70s that sex or gender, whatever you want to call it, was on there at all. And the reason it started being introduced is the US government started lobbying the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a small Montreal-based UN agency that oversees things like passports, to add it. And the reason they added it was mop haircuts and bell-bottoms. They said androgynous fashion of the 70s was throwing people off at airports. Who's a man? Who's a woman? Everyone's confused. We have to start putting this on our passports. Up until then, it wasn't mandatory. And a lot of countries just didn't have it. Of course, you want it recorded on your birth certificate. There are reasons for health. You would want your doctor to know. But there's absolutely no reason that it needs to be on a travel document, except for the androgynous 1970s fashion. So it's interesting that you asked about the US passports. The reason, so this is an incredible scholar, journalist named Samantha Allen, who's trans herself, lives out in Seattle. And she dug all of this up in an article about a year ago. And the reason she found all of it is that there is a person suing the US government. He's now going to sue 4 different secretaries of state because they keep changing, to get an X on his passport. That's what he wants. And we're one of the only countries that doesn't, not one of the only, but we are not allowing it currently, even though there's no reason. Like if you scan your passport at an airport and it has an X, nothing, the computers will be fine with it. They're all actually systematized to do it, and they have been for quite a while. So that's how this was actually discovered, is that the court asked, what's the history of this? What is the legitimacy of a sex being listed on a passport? It turns out it's 1970s fashion trends. So think back, blame yourselves, I don't know. And it shows, again, it shows again where these things don't come from anywhere particularly profound. They just come out of the social fabric of what was going on at any particular time, and why it's not a horrible thing to think about loosening the restrictions we have about it. So in Japan, what we're able to do was recruit people. We actually use social media in the reverse in this time, so we usually use it to project things out there, compete with the cute pandas, get attention to our information. We now use it to say, hey, do you have a story you want to share about this? Come talk to us. Fill out this survey, give us your email address, we'll be in touch, and we'll find a way to interview you where you're comfortable, when you're comfortable. We'll keep it private, so on and so forth. And that's in part because there's a lot of amazing organizations in Japan, but not one that quite does what we do, and people aren't quite accustomed to telling their stories in that way, in particular to strangers. So we had to build some trust by using different methodologies that way. This is the law in Japan. It's been in force since 2004, and this is what you have to do if you want to legally change your gender. Now, all of those bullet points down bottom are technically a form of discrimination, and we can push back on any of them, but the one we really chose to focus on was this one. I'm sorry, the colors are bad. And it says to not have gonads or permanently lack functioning gonads. What that means is they want you to be sterilized, right? Irreversible surgery to sterilize you, which for people who don't want that and don't need it for any medical reason means you are opting in to hormone replacement therapy for the rest of your life, just to change this thing that appeared on your document essentially because of something as arbitrary as a fashion trend a couple decades ago. So when we're asking people to jump over that hurdle to do that type of thing when it's not covered by insurance, it's not medically indicated, and some people are actually told not to do it, especially younger people who are told this means your natural hormone production is going to go away. And for some people with certain conditions, they're medically not supposed to do that. Their doctors will say you can't, and they won't sign off on it, so they're stuck. And some of the people we interviewed were in that position. But more than anything, it creates this indignity of choosing between walking through life and not being questioned every time someone looks at your documents, or undergoing an expensive, irreversible, and unnecessary surgical procedure that you might not want. Now, some people do want it, and go for it. Like, that's totally available. But to have this type of a law in place is something we push back on. Also because any type of forced sterilization, as we know from history, is a human rights violation, and everyone agrees on that, including the World Health Organization. So it's sort of a consensus around that. The pushback we get, so this is a man named Fumino Sugiyama. He is the chair of Tokyo Pride. He owns 3 restaurants. He's a pretty successful businessman. He's a trans man. And the pushback we get from the government when we go with him and we go have these meetings in Tokyo is that, well, we'd love to get rid of it, but then society will get confused. No one will walk down the street knowing who's a man and who's a woman. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I also don't know that that's necessarily sufficient justification to keep doing this to people, but that is where they're at. And so this is one way that he has pushed back on it. This is a photo I took sitting next to him at our press conference at the event that we created out of our report back in March. But there are times when you can say something like that, and we do over and over again. We said that 4 more times that day. He said it in meetings, and the government officials who are in charge of the law, it just doesn't land. It doesn't make a difference in how they think about it. They're thinking about different things. They may have never thought about this before. It doesn't necessarily bother them. And they'll be polite, but they're not, you can tell they're not going to budge. So you have to think really creatively about what you're going to do to tell these stories. Here's an example.
僕自身は、乳房切除を行ったんですけれども、まだ子宮卵巣の摘出が終わってないので、その条件を満たすことができなくて戸籍の変更はできていないと。
10 seconds, he says exactly what's going on, why he doesn't want to undergo it. So we loop that in, we put that on a number of different platforms that can communicate it very, very clearly. He's well known enough that that is something we can put out. We had to think of another way of telling the story as well, and this is again comes out of the benefit of sitting down with people, spending time with them, and learning their full story. Have a look at this version.
彼女がシングルマザーという形で、法律上はなっている。なので僕はただのその同居人という、ね、これだけ毎日おむつ替えてミルクあげてってやっていても、何も関係性はないっていうのが現実かなと。
Again, in 12 seconds we tell a full story, but it's a very different one. And we've been able to get some of the most powerful people in the government hooked on that. He walks into the meeting with them and they say, we hear there's a law that's not allowing you to be a father, that's not allowing you to take care of your kid. They don't really think about genital surgery, right? They don't think about the trans population, the LGBT community. What they think of, they identify it as a parent, right? And they engage with it in that way. This is another advantage we have with editing, with being able to deploy things in a different way, with being able to tell a story, similar to talking about the mosque run by a transgender woman that pierces that narrative and sort of changes it. It's not name and shame. It's not saying this is bad and you're the bad one doing it. It's saying this is way more complicated than you think, and these are the lives that you're ruining. It's not just him, who's a perfectly functional, awesome adult business owner. And you could see how a government official could sit there and be like, yeah, I get why this is bad, but at the end of the day, like, your life seems okay. But it's actually the kid. The kid's gonna grow up in a completely precarious legal situation. We could go down the rabbit hole of the Japanese legal system to talk about exactly why, but they can identify with that and understand why the law is problematic. And that's another thing that we try to do. So, I think that's it. Yay. Okay, that's it. That is how we try to think about it now. Those are trying to give some quick examples of it. I want to leave time for questions because it'll be more interesting once you all are in charge. But this is just a snippet of how we're working. I think the Japan law is going to change. Our next tactic, just to give you a sense, we are to push back on that idea that society will fall apart if we stop sterilizing trans people, which is ridiculous and an abusive thing to say, but something I think they very, very deeply believe. If you look at who Japan is allied with politically and economically around the world, it's a lot of Western European countries. All of those Western European countries in 2003, when Japan passed this law, the mandatory sterilization law, had the exact same law. Germany, the Netherlands, France, all of them. So they have subsequently in 15 years gotten rid of it, right? Because they've said, this is bad, this is discrimination, this is torture, this is awful, this is illegal. And I don't think any of those countries have fundamentally fallen apart at a societal level. It's a matter of opinion, you might think they have. But we can actually have their ambassadors go talk to the Minister of Justice and say, hey, look, we understand that this isn't something that you're going to prioritize right now, but we're going to tell you that these Human Rights Watch people are not going to leave you alone until you do, which is true. But also, in our experience, this has actually been a really good thing. We have more trans people who can openly participate in the economy. We have more people who can travel better. And society hasn't fallen apart, you know? And to have the German ambassador do that, or to have the ambassador from the Netherlands do that, is an entirely different type of bidding than to have me do it, or to have my colleagues in Tokyo do it. So we try to build these coalitions around it and message it in different ways. It's, again, not just a matter of knocking on the door and constantly telling them they're doing terrible things. So I'm going to stop there, but please ask me questions and I will try to answer them. If I don't know an answer, I'll try to point you in the right direction. Thank you for coming out. There's no electricity in the whole city. Yeah.
One of the things that we've seen fairly recently here in America happened very rapidly was the change in people's perception of gay marriage.
Yeah.
I wondered if Human Rights Watch had their hand in that. Was that a project?
Yes, it's all us. No. Maybe a little bit. So we do, let me give you a broader overview then talk about this specifically, because I think it's a really interesting question. Until last year, so for 12 years, I had a colleague in our LGBT rights program, our advocacy director. His name was Boris Dietrich. And he was a former member of parliament in the Netherlands. So he was kind of our senior diplomat who would go around the world and have these very high-level meetings, because that's the background he came from and could carry himself. When he was in parliament the first time around, he wrote the same-sex marriage law for the Netherlands, so the first in the world. So it's all his fault. It all fell apart after that, right? But he came from that background. Even in the Dutch parliament in the early 2000s, this wasn't an easy issue to talk about, and it wasn't easy to be an openly gay politician in that space either. I mean, it seems like it might have been, but this is still 20-ish years ago, right? In the U.S. in particular, I mean, we wrote an amicus brief for the Supreme Court talking about international human rights law. We wrote a number of things over the years supporting the various court cases, but I think because we're not a litigation organization, we did just do our little part and then stay out of it. On the public opinion thing, it is amazing to see how hard or how quickly it has changed. Yeah. It's amazing, and I don't know necessarily what to attribute it to. Before Human Rights Watch, one of the jobs I had was working at a think tank that did more quantitative work on LGBT rights and a lot of public opinion work. And I had one colleague there, a political scientist, who looked at these types of questions, and I don't know that there's one answer, but one thing he thought was really interesting is he was looking at the Chick-fil-A protests. So, right, Chick-fil-A's owners donate money to a lot of anti-gay things, and people go have these kiss-in protests and stuff at their local Chick-fil-A. And when you do a public opinion poll in the area around a Chick-fil-A, the people who live geographically closest to it tend to change their minds more quickly in favor of same-sex marriage rights because they think the pushback, and they just want to eat the chicken, right? They just want it to so public opinion changes in some really, really strange ways. It's not linear, but I do think it is remarkable to see, whether it be through celebrity visibility or whatever else has changed it over time. It's amazing.
It seemed to me that the way that the change happened was sort of grassroots, like people were feeling more and more free to come out, and so you kept hearing, oh, so-and-so, my friend so-and-so's daughter is gay, so, you know, and I think that's the way, and some very conservative people.
Yeah.
That, you know, they're good friends, who are having same-sex weddings. We've had them in our family.
And I think it speaks volumes to the different types of stories that matter to people. If it's a relative that might change your worldview. I mean, look at the 2017 summer tweets that Trump put out about the transgender military ban, right? All of a sudden, trans service members are banned from the military through a series of tweets. Even the military feels blindsided. Orrin Hatch put out a press release in support of transgender troops. I was like, that is really off-brand for him. Like, that is not what you'd expect. But again, for him, it was a military dignity issue. Sort of like we're talking about Fumino's story, for some people is an issue of parenting and fatherhood. It's not an issue of gender identity. And I think that matters. And unfortunately, it took it to that point for Hatch to change his mind and actually embrace the dignity of trans people in a small way. But I do think that type of thing matters. And at a grassroots level, yeah, you can imagine what would change someone's mind.
So would you say it's kind of an issue of an expanded identification that gay rights are just human rights? So.
Yeah, I think there's that. I mean, I think Look, I think it can also be the opposite of the Indonesia situation, right? Governments can take leadership, right? It made a huge difference when Obama had that interview on whoever was interviewing him on NBC or something, where he said, I've evolved and I now support same-sex marriage rights. That tipped everything, right? From there on out, something was going to happen, right? We saw that in Taiwan as well. So Taiwan became the first country in Asia to legally recognize same-sex marriage. And, right in the lead up to that, last year, they had a public referendum on the issue. And we don't believe that any fundamental rights issue, as Human Rights Watch, no fundamental rights issue should be put up for a public vote. That's not how they work. That said, so far public referenda on same-sex marriage, like in Ireland, have tended to work out well. The one in Taiwan did not. People were overwhelmingly opposed, in part because right-wing groups in the US funded the anti-marriage campaign, and they were more vocal, they were more visible, and they just got more people to go out and vote, which is part of the reason we don't like referenda on fundamental rights. The government still followed what the Supreme Court told them to do, and they still passed it. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of political courage to do it, and that makes an enormous difference. I read something recently that there's already been 1,000 gay divorces. The other side of the coin. Very, very successful, right? That's great. That's part of the right to marry is the right to divorce. So, I think I think it can happen in a lot of different ways. I think if we knew how to manipulate public opinion, we might work more on that. Try to stay away from that a little bit. For us, it's just messaging and contributing to it in whatever way we can.
Yeah. You mentioned that sometimes you would have to have your director go through interviews with CNN. I don't know if it was actually the director, not anybody. But how do you, as the researchers, make sure that the people who go and do the policy work or the interviews, they don't misinterpret the facts or misrepresent the facts, or maybe, I'm thinking the telephone game.
How do they get it right? They do. It's amazing. So our executive director, I think he has a photographic memory. I mean, he's just extraordinary. So every year we put out a world report, which is a book-length, like 800-page state of human rights around the world, and he does a press conference and can literally answer a question on any page of it. It's like another league of human operation. I don't understand how he does it. In terms of people representing us on the media or in different meetings or stuff like that, it's an amount of trust you have to have with the people you work with. I try to come from a position that I understand that our Berlin director is not an expert on LGBT issues, no more than he's an expert on refugee issues. So if he is going to go do an appearance, he gets in touch with me and I try to tell him in as simply a form as possible, understanding that he's not going to be able to digest an entire report. That said, I'm also really impressed that with the amount of stuff we put out into the world, like our advocacy directors is what we call them. They're kind of our diplomats who are out there doing a lot of the public speaking and a lot of the public representation. They follow most of it. They may not follow every single detail, but they're pretty on top of it. And they're very eager to take it up. Yeah. Which is impressive, because I don't have the patience for that. I don't think I can personally absorb that much information, but it's amazing. Yeah.
And I would imagine, there's 500 people and there's a lot of different cogs running.
Yeah.
I was like, how do they keep up with that?
It's amazing. I mean, so these video clips that I've shown you, for example, is a whole team that just works on that. And it's an incredible blessing that I don't have. First of all, I don't know how. I don't know how to edit a video. I don't have a clue. So even in a situation where I'm behind the camera asking the questions because I know the topic really well, the footage then just goes to them and they construct a story, right? In this case, we knew Fumino was struggling with being legally recognized as a father. I didn't know that was going to come across so powerfully in the interview, and I also didn't know there was going to be a 12-second version of it that we could put together. They're geniuses. That's amazing what they've done. I could never pull off, and it's just amazing to have colleagues who come at it from those different perspectives. We have a whole new department opening on tech and human rights, so understanding artificial intelligence. I don't know if you've seen any of the reporting coming out of A lot of it's coming out of the UK right now because they're reforming their welfare system, but they're trying to train robots to determine welfare benefits, and it's really messing with people because people will just be people who need it, or people who really need to access certain things are just all of a sudden told by an algorithm that they're no longer eligible. And the algorithms are not good, right? They're not. It's not the same as having a social worker evaluate you and follow your case and stuff like that. So we have a whole group of people who really understand how that works and what artificial intelligence has to offer and what it doesn't. Similarly, we have a whole arms division that works on weapons. So one of the things that they work on, and I'm not making this up, is what it's actually called is killer robots. So they work on these fully autonomous weapons that militaries are developing that they look like people. They look like stormtroopers out of Star Wars with full weapons. And this is what militaries think the future of war is. Now the problem is these robots can't tell the difference between someone pointing a gun at them and a little girl holding an ice cream cone to give them a lick of it, and they will blow her brains out, right? This is the argument we're trying to make. They make visuals about that. They do all kinds of advocacy. They're trying to get a treaty signed by powerful governments, including the US, including Japan, to say, no, just like landmines, no, this is not going to happen because this is just, wars are bad enough. We don't need unaccountable robots fighting them for us. Again, that's the surface level stuff that I know. It's amazing, I'm impressed, but it's not stuff I work on, and it's just really, really cool to know that people go to this level of depth with all these different things.
I have a question. Can you tell them how Human Rights Watch raises money, or where you get your money?
Where you get our money? So we have never, since we were founded in 1978, we never take any money from any government anywhere. And that can be hard. It can be really, really tempting, especially with governments that are actually pretty good on human rights issues and have a lot of money and want to help you out and want to fund things. But it's important for our independence because you don't know how quickly a government's going to flip into being not so good. And you also want to maintain the independence. We don't want to be the mouthpiece of a Scandinavian government, or we don't want to be seen as a mouthpiece of this or that. So we're very, very independent in that way. The way we do it is primarily through individual funding. Most of the places where we have offices, or all of the places where we have offices, we have small boards of directors who are either supporters or networked in with people who want to donate money, but people donate their own money. They believe in it. They come. They learn about what we do. They're really involved with what we do, in some cases with the advocacy, because they are prominent people. Our Tokyo committee, for example, has been just absolutely fabulous, getting us meetings with certain government, because they all have they all work with these people. They know them. They all went to high school with them in some cases, so they can find them. And then from foundations, so the traditional Soros, MacArthur, Ford foundations, but also a lot of smaller family foundations. I think about 40% of our money now comes out of Europe, and increasingly we're raising money in places like Japan. We raise some money in Lebanon, places like that. It can be a challenge, for sure. I mean, it's a big organization, and we want to be legally registered. We want to have all these things. And you have to remember, a lot of countries don't have philanthropic policies. So there's a lot of places in the world you donate money, you don't get a tax write-off, right? There's not the same incentives that we have here in the States, which is why, to some extent, I think we will end up being primarily US funded for a good deal of our future as we have. A lot of fundraising in Hollywood, a lot of it's anonymous, but I know some of them are. No, I mean some of it's public, some of it's not. I mean, so for example, one of our founding board members, a really, really extraordinary philanthropist, he just passed away this year. His name is Sid Sheinberg. He produced Schindler's List, and he discovered Steven Spielberg. And so when he passed away, Steven Spielberg gave $1 million in his memory, right? For our funding.
Nice.
That's a really, I mean, obviously for credibility, that's wonderful. But it also just shows Sid was absolutely amazing. The LGBT rights program wouldn't exist without Sid. And he thought this stuff was important and thought it was cool and got people to give money to it before anyone else could. The LGBT program started in 2004. At that time, we were the only mainstream human rights organization to have an LGBT program specifically.
How long have you worked in this capacity?
So I'm a recidivist. I've been back and forth a few times, but I've accumulated about 7 years in the Health and Human Rights Program, the Refugee Program, the Children's Program, and now in the LGBT.
So your office, based in New York, how much of your time was out in the world?
Is not in New York?
Not in New York.
For me and for my fellow researcher colleagues, I can't say this for everyone, so some people live where they work, right? So our Indonesia researcher lives in Jakarta, so he's constantly in it, right? And works from home. For me, I'm gone about half of my time, I would say. Sometimes a little more, depending on what the project is. And I'd say for my portfolio of work, about half of it is planned. The Japan stuff we started 5 years ago because we knew we could work in reverse. It's a very predictable, stable government. It's like we knew, for example, one of the other big hooks we're using, they're hosting the Olympics this summer. The Olympics has a non-discrimination charter. It also puts you on the world platform, so we're going to try to use that as another hook to try to get them to pay more attention to this. We know that stuff. You can know that far in advance. Indonesia was, I woke up one morning and there were a bunch of tweets from the Minister of Education, and we were like, uh-oh. And that became a whole, that's 2 full reports since 2016 on that, so it's a lot more time there than ever predicted. So leave a little bit of flexibility for that and move things around.
Had any experiences where you felt threatened?
For me, no. I've never had any experience where I felt physically threatened. We take a lot of steps to make sure that doesn't happen. We're more worried about the safety of the people we meet with than our own. There's the worst that's going to happen to me is I get put on a plane and I get sent home, and maybe I can't go to that place anymore. So it's bad, it's annoying, it interrupts what we're trying to do, but we're really concerned about any type of repercussions for the individuals we meet with. So we have a whole security team. Every trip I go on has to be fully planned and vetted by someone with a military and security background who make sure we're, has a whole access to security information, so we can make sure, we can read the newspapers about what's happening in Bangladesh, but he actually knows what the intelligence chatter is and some of the more in-depth information. I can also just make sure we're staying in a hotel that has 24/7 security and stuff like that. He vets all of that to make sure, and then we have to be really careful about where we meet people. There's some trips I've gone on where you have to change hotels every night. There's some trips where I've gone on where if you do that, it's a red flag right away, and someone's going to come knocking on your door the 3rd or 4th night, and you're like, sir, tourists don't change hotels every night. What are you doing? So it really depends on that type of thing.
What efforts do you take to blend in, or do you have to if there's a military
like a security state?
Posse.
Yeah.
Do you have to, change your look, or do you have to take elements to seem as if you belong, or do you not even have to?
So I don't blend well. Maybe in like Sweden I could blend in, but yeah. I mean, in all seriousness, to a certain extent, yes, but a lot of that is more about infrastructural choices than anything else. So for example, a lot of places I will deliberately stay in a hotel that I know is going to be full of white tourists, right? I will meet people who I'm interviewing, and sometimes public places are the safest places, right? Because it doesn't arouse suspicion, right? There's some projects where I do rent another hotel room and that's our meeting room and we go because it's private, but other places where for the people I'm interviewing to walk through a hotel lobby and get, that's more risky than meeting them at a Starbucks. I did a project in Greece when I was with the Refugee and Children's Rights Program, and we were interviewing a bunch of migrants and asylum seekers in Greece. This is back in 2012. And I can remember part of this is always asking people where they're comfortable, because people know their security situation the best. Sometimes we can be a little skeptical and be like, are you sure? But usually people will make really good decisions. And we were meeting a bunch of Ethiopian migrants, and they were like, here's where you're going to meet us. And we looked it up on Google, we found it, and it was a all vegan organic death metal cafe with these giant speakers with really angry loud music playing. And they said, this is the only place we feel safe around the punks and around the people with purple hair. They don't ask us questions, they're nice to us. So we had to scream at each other to do the interview because we're sitting in this, and that was great. If that was actually a perfect security assessment, and they were probably totally right. This is a time when vigilantes in Athens were going after people of color and attacking them. And if the only place they felt safe and cool was at a punk cafe, that's what we're gonna do. My hearing took a while to recover, but that's the position we're always going to start from. I've also, we interviewed a bunch of kids in Indonesia once, a bunch of Burmese migrants, Rohingya, and their teacher who was organizing it for us said, we have to do it during outings. You obviously can't come to the detention center where they live because then everyone's going to see who met with whom. So we went to a taxidermy museum. It was very strange. There's a bunch of very odd animals and like very mediocre taxidermy. But it was actually great because the kids were super distracted. So you could actually talk to them one at a time. You didn't have people swarming around you. It was actually a brilliant idea. So sometimes it's just negotiations like that as much as possible. And then sometimes it's opting out. Sometimes it's not me on purpose because I am a 6'5" white guy. And that's not good in some places. So we do have to be as careful as possible.
So Kyle, what, from your perspective, if you're going to rate countries in the world with egregious violations against LGBT people, what would they be?
Well, look, we hesitate to rank anyone, right? Because every country in the world's got human rights problems. There are some, obviously, that stand out, right? So you can look at Uganda. Earlier this week, they announced they're reintroducing a bill that introduces the death penalty for homosexuality, right? That's a clear backslide that is worse than Japan, right? That's just an objective comparison you can make. I think, you can look in Asia and you can look at Brunei, which also just put in a Sharia public flogging law for homosexuality, which is terrible. And all of a sudden everyone started looking up where is Brunei. It's this tiny little island off of Indonesia. I think what we also try to look for is where there are glints of hope. And I'm not just trying to pivot on your question like a politician, but I think this is actually how we try to think about it instead of ranking. So take, for example, the mess in Indonesia that I just described. There was this incredible constitutional court judgment last year where the court said, the petitioners were asking, as a bunch of agricultural science professors, because they have the qualifications to do this, they were asking the government to criminalize adult consensual same-sex conduct. And the judges, who are not particularly progressive, made this very, very solid argument. They said, we're throwing this petition out because we know there are things other than criminal law in society that can lead people to behave certain ways. Now, that's not a victory for human dignity, but given the context that they were operating in, that's extraordinary, right? They rejected the petition, one, because everyone thought the petition was going to win. They thought Indonesia was going to go on that map of countries that criminalize, here we go, first time ever. And they rejected on the grounds where they scolded them. And they said, this is ridiculous. You have plenty of other tools in your toolbox to shame gay people if that's what you want. But the criminal law is not one of them. That was really, really effective in that way. And we see little glints of hope like that in all kinds of places as well. So objectively speaking, yes, of course, something like Uganda that's happening is absolutely terrible. Is it gonna be able to rank like that's number one, then Brunei's number two? I don't know, right? It'd be really, really hard to compare these things. I think within each one of these like relatively negative situations, there are these little glints of hope that happen as well.
Are there any countries that ban, either officially or unofficially, the entrance of Human Rights Watch?
Ooh, good question. We were just talking about this in the drive down today.
Thank you for asking.
There are lists, and I'm going to forget all of them. Cuba, for example, doesn't allow us in. There was a long period of time where Uzbekistan did not allow us in, even though we did have the cotton forced labor in the cotton fields impact there a few years back. We are now, and I don't know a lot about it. Again, this is one of the things that I didn't have the bandwidth to actually follow. But we're now challenging Israel for trying to kick us out.
Israel.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a whole team of people who work in Israel and the occupied territories, and they are trying to kick out our director.
Is Israel very much anti-society?
No, and this is one of the arguments they make. So the Israeli government likes to say they're the only thriving democracy in the Middle East, so we should leave them alone and let them do what they want, and all of those things. They also have this military occupation problem, which we point out to them quite frequently, where we also document Hamas committing human rights violations. We're deliberately very, very, very balanced on this issue because, again, we don't take a side on this particular thing. But the Netanyahu government really wants us out, and we're fighting it in the Supreme Court.
So it's not for them, obviously, it's not the gender issue.
No, it's everything else, yeah.
What about China? You
We haven't been, I don't think we've been officially kicked out of China, but access to China is very, very difficult. We do have a China team that works on China. They all live outside of China. And I don't know if they go in, and I don't know if they would tell me if they did.
North Korea.
North Korea, we definitely do not have access. And again, you saw a short clip of our executive director talking about the sexual violence report we did
I watched that whole thing.
in North Korea. That is based on people who ran across the border. Our North Korea researcher lives in South Korea, is part of this network of defectors, and that's how we can do it. Some war zones we don't have access for all the obvious reasons. Some we do. We have a whole team that just goes into war zones. That is all they do. They specialize in it, and they're really, really good at it. Again, with incredible security precautions, but they're obviously not as safe as I am when I go to Jakarta. So, there are countries that will declare we don't have access, and there are some where we'll make it happen.
Is this work difficult emotionally? And do you have to take special care to take care of yourselves?
We do have a 24-hour counselor on retainer. I wonder how busy she is. We actually have two, because we run in 2 different time zones, and because I think they get a lot of phone calls. Look, that's an investment the organization makes in taking care of us, which is important for any workplace, but especially one that is this, by its nature, quite intense. I find it quite edifying. I still think it's pretty, I still think it's pretty cool, right? Yeah, on balance. And it's large part because I think no matter what, I would wake up in the morning thinking about this type of thing and worrying about it and caring about it. So the fact that I wake up in the morning thinking and caring and worrying about it, and then I get to go to work and try to do something about it, that's pretty much a blessing. So yeah, there are bad days. But some of it is just really edifying to also know that at the end of the day, a lot of it is just really bad politics, right? It's just, yes, it is ruining people's lives, and it's my job to document that and put it out into the world, and that can be really, really hard because I'm engaging with people who have been through something that would have ruined me, right? And they're somehow surviving. And that's the other thing, is that there's not a single interview I've ever done, even with someone who has gone through just some hellscape of an experience, where they haven't cracked a joke. Right? They have a sense of humor. They're all fully well-rounded people like any of us are. And you establish that rapport and you spend time with them. And in some cases, I'm the only person they're ever going to tell their story to. So yeah, it's hard, but it's not as hard for me as it is for them. Take a day off. Take a breath.
Play outside.
Yeah, go outside.
But it's really powerful to be able to tell your story, though.
Yeah. And I think it also is a reminder. So there's this one story that sticks with me. I told the students this morning this because someone asked me what was the hardest story I've ever heard. And again, I would be willing to rank that if I could think of it, but I can't actually think of some because they're all so awful. And ranking people's suffering seems kind of off to me. But there's one in particular that stuck with me, not because it's particularly harsh, but because it speaks to why it's so important to keep telling the truth, even in the unshameable fake news era. So this was actually 2015 when we were doing our project in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan's a really, really interesting country, Russian-speaking country. The landmass is the size of Western Europe, but there's only 16 million people in it, which is the population of the Netherlands, right? So it's vast. And there's a couple cities, but it's really, really empty. It's also quite wealthy and quite stable compared to the rest of its neighbors. So it has this veneer of stability that if you scratch beneath the surface isn't entirely there, right? They don't allow labor unions, they don't allow gay people. It's actually quite bad for a lot of minority groups in particular. And we were doing this research really rapidly, in particular because Kazakhstan was considering passing one of these gay propaganda laws, Russia style, that says you can only talk about gay people in public if it's negative, right? You can't say positive things. And there were no LGBT activist groups in the country. There was no, the starting point was very, very, very basic. I was going in and talking to nurses who worked at an HIV clinic saying, hey, where do I go meet people? How do I find people to talk to about their experiences? And we kind of snowballed out from there. And it was my last day there. I'd been there for a couple weeks. And so I actually had my luggage with me, which is always awkward, because I literally had to go to the airport when this interview ended. And I was meeting with this 26-year-old woman who was in a relationship with another woman, and they were raising a 4-year-old daughter together. I can't remember, one of them had the daughter from a previous marriage with them. And the interview was actually quite positive. It was one of these ones that actually had a lot of alacrity with it because she was really proud. They were really proud of how they had jury-rigged their entire life to convince everyone that they weren't a lesbian couple. They had a way of faking it with the daycare, they had a way of faking it with the house cleaner. They just had all these stories they could tell people that they were safe. And they had accomplished this with basically no support and improvised this incredible resilience in their life. So she was really great. And it was actually really great to end on that after 2 weeks of hearing pretty bad stuff. And then at the end of the interview, and this is what I do with everyone I talk to, is I say, hey, look, you've been amazing and you spent 2 or 3 hours telling me some of those intimate things of your life and the worst things that have happened to you. Do you have any questions for me? With the same privacy, I'm happy to, what do you want to know? About the work I do, about me, just, give them that opportunity. And usually people just say no, like most people. And she said, yes, I have a question. I was like, okay, here we go. And she said, you're American, so you would know, do you think my daughter's going to be okay when she grows up? And I said, well, yeah, I don't know what me being American has to do with that, but sure, yeah, I think your daughter's going to be fine. Why do you ask? And she said, well, when I go online, and she only speaks Russian, right? So when I go online and Google in Russian, same-sex parenting, this study from America comes up. And it's a sociologist who has data from thousands of families, and it shows that kids raised by same-sex parents have bad outcomes. They're more likely to not get jobs, have mental health issues, and it shows that same-sex parents are doing a bad job. And this is what comes up, and I'm scared that we might be hurting our kid, and I'm wondering, should I give her to my mom? Should I have her go raise somewhere else? This is, what can you tell me? And it was incredible because the study she's talking about does exist, right? It's by a sociologist named Mark Regnerus, who taught at University of Texas, and it was thoroughly debunked. He was fired, the journal had to retract it. It turns out he falsified all of the data. But this was a very influential study throughout all of the state-level court cases on same-sex marriage before it got to the Supreme Court. And it had a lot of sway because it was an academic study. He had thousands of families that he followed, and he made these very convincing arguments. And it turned out he faked it all. But the people who translated that into Russian didn't translate the retraction. And they didn't translate the story about him getting fired. So in her world, this was still the incontrovertible truth. And it broke my heart, but it also showed me how important it is that we keep putting truth out there, right? Because I wanted her to be able to Google and find something else, right? I'm not going to change everyone's life with human rights activism. That's not how it works. But there is something to be said for the fact that in her world of information, she was being delegated. And I'm sure, I don't know, I have no evidence of this, but I'm sure it was some nefarious anti-gay group that decided to translate it into Russian. It wasn't like a Russian university that said, oh, this is intellectually interesting, let's put it on the internet. That's not how that works. It was put on the internet outside of a paywall so people could get to it, because that's the message they wanted to send out. So for me, that was one that stood out as particularly powerful, because it just spoke to why we do what we do, even when changing policy or changing broader public opinion just takes a long time and is really a long game. If someone can Google something and find a slight counter-narrative, that makes a huge difference as well. And a lot of the times we don't know if that happens, we just kind of have to believe that it does, but that's why her story stuck with me in particular.
Okay. So in the broad spectrum of human rights, there's some obvious, I would say, universal truths, about freedom of life and liberty and such. Do you ever run into gray areas because of cultural differences where you don't really have a universal, code or something like that, or standard?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I can adequately answer that one. That'd be a good question for a human rights lawyer in particular. Look, I'll put it this way. I don't think this is exactly what you're asking, but this is one way I can think of answering that. We get that type of pushback all the time from governments. Like, oh, this doesn't apply in our culture, this doesn't. And the easy response there is to say, well, then why did you sign the treaty that says it, right? We only use international human rights law these governments have all signed up to. So we can just say, well, sorry, but you signed up to this thing that said freedom of speech. You signed up to this thing that said freedom of association. You can't just pretend it doesn't apply. You didn't do that unwittingly. You sent someone who gave you permission to sign it. That's not a particularly effective response in a lot of these places, but it is sort of where we stand on principle.
Yeah.
And to your broader question, yeah, I can't think of anything specifically. I mean, certainly on LGBT issues, we do get told, like, there aren't gay people here, or like whatever. We're kind of used to that. We can have that chat, like, there are, that's not true. And there are different ways to work around it. But I think it's probably, it's a really big question for all the stuff we work on, not only this.
Well, when I heard you talk in Waterville, you did refer to cultural differences as entering in terms of strategy. Specifically in Japan. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the strategy of how you tell stories, absolutely. And it's a real challenge in some places, but again, this is part of, like, the stuff that I can say I'm working on, like I'm doing it with a team that makes those little decisions as well on how we're telling the story and stuff like that. And we also, the internet lets you experiment a little bit with that, so we've had some different, we had a series of videos about healthcare reform in the US a few years ago. And if you follow us on Facebook, you'll start seeing this stuff, but we have 4 different people telling the story. So one of them is a nun, one of them is a nurse, one is a teamster, and one somewhere else. And it's just they're all saying the same thing, but it matters who the messenger is, it matters how they're delivering it. And we're starting to experiment a little bit like that, because one of the interesting things about the internet is, like, feedback is free. You can see, 500,000 people watched the video of the nun within a day, but the teamster only got like 10,000. Like, what's up with that? Like, and then we can try to launch it a few days later with a different tagline on it and see where that goes. So some of that is communicating like that as well, paying attention to trends. Our media department's amazing for that reason. A lot of the times they'll have us rephrase stuff because they'll say that's not why anyone's talking about it. That's not, like, you guys are all policy people, go back to your desks and do that. But they'll talk about, this is the way that media talks to each other these days. Yeah. Even 10 years ago when we started producing videos, some of the more traditional human rights people and staff were just like, what's the point? Now it's just like, things don't exist without a video clip, right? You can't get that video of Fumino. There's a full version of it on YouTube that tells his whole story. We put that on Instagram and 1 million people watched it within 24 hours. And we can tell, which is pretty amazing, right? The level of engagement we have with that type of thing.
So you were talking to the kids at Casco Bay. What did you tell them about Angola with the LGBT?
Students this morning were asking about sort of things going in the right direction or wrong direction or so on and so forth, and I tried to see if they could guess which is the country that most recently decriminalized same-sex conduct, but now it's been given away.
Certainly wouldn't be.
We have a lot of
It was Angola.
students from Angola.
But then you told them where the law originally came from.
Yeah, I mean, so these laws, if you look at the map, I don't have it, but we have interactive maps, if that's your thing, of the 76 countries that still criminalize adult consensual homosexual behavior, whatever you want to call it. And none of them actually say that, to be clear. They all say, like, abstract things like debauchery or carnal intercourse against the order of nature or someone. And they're written like that because they're written by the British colonial empire. They weren't written by modern day lawmakers. These are colonial relics that were used to control the native population. They didn't come out of some, like, indigenous desire to hate gay people or to hate people who are gender non-conforming. And so we've supported a lot of the pushback against that. There's some cultures in Indonesia that recognize 5 different genders, and then you have this government that's running this crackdown. There's other ways of talking about it that aren't just like about laws and stuff like that, to show people, like, this wasn't you that wrote this. India repealed their British colonial era law last year. I mean, think about that. That's 15% of the world gay people overnight were no longer criminals. That's unbelievable, right? Just because India's huge. That's amazing. And it's not going to be quite as straightforward in other places. There's a lot of other countries that have the exact same law, and it's getting challenged on similar grounds. But yeah, a lot of that is figuring out the right tactic to get policymakers. The Indian Supreme Court judgment's amazing. It's 450 pages long. I thought I wrote long reports. These guys just went, they quote Shakespeare. It's really amazing. It's like this poem on human dignity. It's really, really, really beautiful coming from a Supreme Court that read that law down. So now we try to marshal that. Same law in Kenya, same British Empire law in Kenya was up for review, and they actually reopened the case to consider the Indian judgment. They didn't care what we had to say. They cared what the Indian Supreme Court had to say.
How did you get started?
How did I get started? So, it was my first job ever. I was a secretary at Human Rights Watch. It's the first job out of college. And then I left and I was working as a journalist. I actually had a really good job as a reporter that I really liked. But I was doing reporting on the same type of stuff. I was actually in the Rohingya internment camps in Myanmar. This was in 2014, so it was after the first bout of violence that got everyone into the camps, but before this most recent one that they ran across the border. So it was during this really tough period, I think, for media to take it seriously, because the government was essentially slowly starving them to death, right? By just like doing one food drop instead of the 3 that were required, and not allowing doctors in, like all of these things. But we were able to get in. We were able to do 4 days of reporting there, and then I was back in my hotel room writing up the stories that I had, and I just realized that everyone I talked to was probably going to be dead within 6 months, and like me putting a story on the internet was not going to do anything about that. So, and that's not a slight on my friends in journalism. Like, it's really important, but like this job was open, and I just, because I was familiar with the organization, I knew that there was a little bit more of that follow through. Or like you asked earlier, there's those colleagues who will take it seriously. That's the other way, because I mean, everything we talked about tonight, I have to explain to everyone I interview, like, who am I, what am I doing, what do I represent, right? Because I'm not their lawyer, I'm not their therapist, you know, I'm not a journalist, but like I'm kind of all of those things all at once, because I want to kind of get to this level of detail. And that's one of the ways I explain it, actually, is I say, look, I have colleagues, I show them a smaller version of that map, and I said, I have colleagues all over the world who are going to care about what you're about to tell me, right? And they're going to do everything they can to make it stop. It's not going to stop tomorrow. It might not even benefit you, to be honest, the way these things change, but this is who we are. It's our people in Brussels and London and Washington and everywhere else that can try to actually use the levers of power that they have to make it stop. And that tends to work as a pretty good description, but that's the same thing that attracted me to doing it as well.
Are there any growing pains in, you mentioned the difference between traditional, well, the report that you were doing before and this extensive questioning? I was thinking in the sense of when they said the best questions to answer sometimes the most simple, but that's also like a hard thing to really put into practice, especially at the beginning. So were there any growing pains or any other growing pains in taking on that in-depth reporting?
Yeah, I mean, so as a reporter, I obviously had to do similar things. I think in this case, again, I have the benefit of talking to a lot of different people. To me, the hardest thing when I'm actually interviewing people is you want to strike this balance between obviously making people very comfortable because they are sharing really hard things, and paying attention, right, the basics of like not interrupting them while they're telling you something, but then also trying to keep track of everything they're saying, because it's also my job to be really skeptical, right? To say like, oh, okay, so you said the police came to your house on Tuesday night and they knocked on your door, and then they came in and then they shot your brother and then this and then that. We're gonna have to go back to each one of those things, because I'm gonna have to make sure that's the order it happened in. I'm gonna have to, you know, where was this person, who is that? So it's kind of maintaining a healthy skepticism while also realizing that this person is telling you something completely traumatic. That's hard. It's really, really hard. It's exhausting. Those are the hardest days. Those are the days when I sleep really well at the end, because it's just a lot to do. And it's a lot to take in.
Do people get frustrated when you have to kind of check back their memory? Trauma pretty hard. The brain doesn't always process things like you think they do.
Yeah.
Do people ever lash out at you or push back at you or ask those questions?
I wouldn't say lash out. People have definitely pushed back because, you know, they know what I'm doing, right? And, you know, I try to do it in a way that's not patronizing or offensive in any way. But sometimes they'll say, hey, look, I don't remember. Was it Monday morning? Was it Monday after? Like, I don't know. It was 7 years ago. Or like, I don't know. A lot's happened. It was really bad. And like, yeah, I remember some stuff that was not traumatic that happened to me, right? Memories aren't perfect. And it's at that point that I know I can just stop, because I'm going to talk to other people about what had happened, right? And so it is, and I don't want to come across that I doubt anyone's story when I'm talking to them, but it is also really important to maintain a healthy level of context and skepticism, and come up with a way of talking about it where you try to say, look, I'm trying to give you an opportunity to explain this as thoroughly as possible. I've never met anyone, myself included, who tells a story in the right order. Everyone goes all over, that's fine. That's my job to keep track of it and try to do the best I can. While also realizing that there are some places I'm going to go where people don't want to, and that's okay. I'm never going to force anyone. All these are voluntary. If they want to stop the interview, stop it. If you don't want to answer a question, we're not going to go there. So people are being really generous with their time. We don't pay people to talk to us, right? That's really, really important. So try to, but yeah, that is one of the tougher parts.